All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Tom Duggett, digital events representative on the Friends of Coleridge Committee and chair for this event today. So I'm delighted to welcome you to this third digital event of 2023 from the Friends of Coleridge. Before we get to our main event today, hearing from Graham Davidson about Wordsworth's Intimations ode, I'd just like to take this opportunity quickly to talk a little bit about the Friends and the larger mission of the Friends behind events such as this. Since 1986, the Friends has existed to foster interest in the life and works of the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge and of his circle. Membership is affordable and it's open to anyone with an interest in or admiration for Coleridge and his work. And while we're committed open-endedly to running free public events such as this one, memberships of the Friends are invaluable in helping us to pursue our mission by publishing the Coleridge Bulletin and running a biennial summer conference. Members receive the bulletin twice a year. We're also happy to announce, as I think you can just about maybe make out behind me, if you can see my background, a little advert there for the Coleridge Conference, which in 2024 will be taking place for the first time at Dove Cottage and the Jerwood Centre in Grasmere, the place where Coleridge wrote Dejection and The Friend. The call for papers for the conference is open now and closes at the end of October. So if you're not yet a member, please do consider joining the Friends. You can search Friends of Coleridge or scan the QR code just up there behind me and click on the Join Us tab on the website. And if you are or have been a member, please do stay with us. It makes a world of difference. And so on to today. This is the third digital event for 2023, following a pair of talks in the spring and early summer this year by Tim Fulford and Joanna Taylor, relating to education and to ecology, each in different ways exploring that same core romantic question that I think animates Graham Davidson's talk for us today of the connection or disconnection of nature and the mind. Taken together, these talks are helping to demonstrate how much is still new in Coleridge today, 2 centuries on from most of his major works. We hope the discussion after Graham's talk today will be open and lively. Please feel free to type in the chat or to use the raise hand function and then unmute, please, only when called. We further hope that this kind of conversazione will help point new directions for other upcoming talks. Graham Davidson has been a key figure in Romantic studies and particularly Coleridge studies for many years. His first book, Coleridge's Career, was published in 1990, and he was until recently the editor of the Coleridge Bulletin, a position he filled for 25 years. He's also published widely in the Charles Lamb Bulletin, the Wordsworth Circle, Romanticism, and the Philological Quarterly, and he's contributed to books including Coleridge's Assertion of Religion, Coleridge in the West Country, the Bible in English Literature, and Revisioning Cambridge Platonism. His latest book was published in March this year and is the ground of his talk for us today on Wordsworth, Coleridge, and the Intelligible Ode. Please join me in welcoming Graham.
Hello, everyone. Actually, the book is going to be published in paperback on the 25th, 2 days' time, and it will be affordable this time, whereas the one published in March was definitely not affordable. This talk is based on the premise that the first business of a critic is to learn how to read a poet in the spirit in which they wrote, to understand, in Collingwood's endlessly relevant formulation, what questions they were asking, why, and how they answered them. My premise, uncontroversial, is that Wordsworth experienced a separation of mind and nature, a separation we now take for granted, that the distinctly human powers of mind are not present in the life and being of nature. It is to us an extraordinary presumption that anyone ever supposed that the mind, in its spiritual and moral qualities, was in some form present in nature. We take our power of reasoning as a tool to understand the physical world and keep the mind's other powers apart. But that union, in some measure sanctioned by Aristotle, was implicit in European thought prior to the formalization by Descartes in 1637 of a distinction that had been developing for nearly 100 years, as far back as Copernicus. Why Wordsworth thought that separation an anathema is a much more difficult question. Why would anyone educated in the 18th century, 100 years after Bacon and Descartes, think the mind and nature division or distinction a chasm to be bridged? After all, it was then the so-called Age of Reason, that reason which had already proved such a powerful method in the analysing or vexing of nature, as Bacon put it. The murdering in order to dissect, as Wordsworth put it. Of course, Coleridge shared Wordsworth's opinion and had some hard words to say about Descartes, as did Eliot for comparable reasons. But Coleridge was familiar with earlier and countervailing philosophies, particularly the Cambridge Platonists among them, in a way that Wordsworth wasn't. The Cambridge Platonists were a group of thinkers who initially admired Descartes and what he made of reason. However, they found a serious and unacceptable flaw in his work. It put God outside his universe. Once he'd made it, then having little or nothing to do with it. Coleridge summed it up with, Descartes was the first man to make nature utterly lifeless and godless. He and Wordsworth wanted to make nature lifey and God full, but the Platonists could not and would not dismiss Descartes' reason, and claimed both the reasonableness of religion and that God, by means of an intermedium, existed in nature, was an immanent power. Reason was their key word, but it was a development of the idea of reason, not an extension of it. The title of Ralph Cudworth's unfinished work epitomizes their approach, the true intellectual system of the universe. So perhaps Wordsworth learnt from Coleridge. Of course, it is possible, and this is only an impression, consciousness of the regrettable division between the life of the mind and the life of nature is far too deeply embedded in Wordsworth thinking for him to have first met with it at the age of 25, at the earliest. On the other hand, it is quite likely that something latent in him was catalyzed into life by Coleridge's conversation. Given the power that both would later ascribe to the imagination, the ability to reunite mind and nature, to realize what they both called the one life, then the year that they spent together in Somerset, 1797 to 8, largely discussing the imagination, so Coleridge tells us, may have been just the stimulus Wordsworth needed to find a focus for his poetry. So, however it came to him, the principal question Wordsworth was intent on answering was, how can mind and nature be reunited? What is the imagination? How is its power expressed? And much of his poetry is the record of that quest in all its varieties. But that isn't the only question he was asking, not the only problem for which he sought a resolution. To put it rather bluntly, he wondered what purpose was served by the course of ordinary human life, especially in cases of undeserved suffering, which conventional narratives often resolve. Think of Silas Marner. His answers were bleak. There is no resolution, and the only monument to years of longing and suffering is a pile of stones or a ruined cottage. Even the happier have no better end. His drowned brother John had become nothing but a name, and of a beloved schoolmaster, Matthew, honoured on a plaque, Wordsworth asked, can it be that these two words of glittering gold are all that must remain of thee? Yes, it is, in respect of our passage through time, whether we suffer or not. Such is the still, sad music of humanity. It isn't a wonderful life. In the ordinary course of things, Wordsworth doesn't pretend there is anything else. Life is one to be got through, doggedly working our way towards the grave. So there are two Wordsworths at the least. The one emboldened by the magnificence of his near mad vision, on a journey that would take him aloft ascending to breathe in worlds to which the heaven of heavens is but a veil, and on his way passing by all strength, all terror, unalarmed at anything that Jehovah with his thunder and the choir of shouting angels could throw at him, who in the mind of man found something more terrifying than ever found in the darkest pit of the profoundest hell, led on this journey by the prospect of arriving at the reality of paradise and groves Elysian, fortunate islands, fields like those of old in the deep ocean, the myth of a lost world realized, paradise regained. In effect, a journey of the mind. And then there is the journey of the body, of the mind without a vision, epitomized in Margaret's life and death, who tied not to paradise, all around her had she the power to see it or feel differently, but to the wretched spot where her cottage stood, endeared to it only by the length of road along which she hoped to see her husband returning, and the rude bench on which she sat nursing that hope. It is difficult to see what these two visions, as we might call them, have to do with each other. It was a dilemma Wordsworth faced and struggled with. I think it is why he attempted to integrate, as far as he could, his two separate stories of the peddler and of Margaret into one poem, what we now call The Ruined Cottage, Book 1 of the Excursion, which compared to any of similar length, Coleridge once described as the finest poem in our language. It is a curious fact that not much of the peddler's story has anything to do with the progress of his life, mostly with the growth of his own mind, a proto-prelude. His death doesn't really come into it. Margaret's story has nothing to do with any kind of intellectual development, only with the history of her suffering ending in death. How did Wordsworth attempt to resolve this standoff? Eventually, in 1814, by giving Margaret a version of the peddler's power of meditation, that power which makes all that we feel of sorrow and despair, from ruin and from change, and all the grief that passing shows of being leave behind, appear an idle dream. This is ruthless stuff. Unless I have misread the passage, the passing shows of being pretty much constitute our daily life from cradle to the grave, and are here consigned to the dustbin of an idle dream. Elsewhere, he declares that habitual perception, the laws of vulgar sense, enslave the mind, so substituting the universe of death, the falsest of all worlds, in place of that which is divine and true. Yes, but what life that really is life can replace this dream, this death? Or what is divine and true? We have to go back to the mind and nature division and to its potential or imagined reunion in order to understand how Wordsworth's idea of life is constituted. And it proves pretty simple. When the discerning intellect of man is wedded to this goodly universe in love and holy passion, then paradise and groves Elysian shall be a simple produce of the common day. We will have got back to that paradise from which we have so long been excluded, an exclusion of which the 17th century was particularly conscious. It should be remembered that Wordsworth uses intellect as a synonym of spiritual, so he is not confining his vision to the intelligent or even to the educated. It is a sacramental or incarnational vision of the ordinary made extraordinary, of habitual or vulgar sense redeemed, when the kingfisher's wing answers light to light, and redeemed, important to notice, through love and holy passion, through an active power. No love, no passion, no redemption from the world of death, which undoes so many. Wordsworth is insistent that this is no esoteric process. By words which speak of nothing more than what we are, would I arouse the sensual from their sleep of death, and win the vacant and the vain to noble raptures. Occasionally, but only occasionally, Wordsworth indulges in a them and us, distinguishing himself as one of the spiritual elect, living in a world of light, opposed to the mass drowned in darkness. In this, he is like Eliot, but unlike, as it is not habitual, perhaps aware that too soon, too early, that power in him had faded almost beyond recognition. I have called this an incarnational vision, creative because it binds mind and nature, body and soul together, but they can exist separately, thanks to Descartes, and because for Wordsworth, mind has its being and origin in God and is the source of creative power, Mind transcends existence and time. We all want to turn away from the word transcendental if we can. It is too limited and too pat a description of Wordsworth's vision, but it is there. He describes the progress of life as passing through all nature to rest in God. I take the transcendental as the parent or poorer cousin of the incarnation of the creative, a power he took as imitative of God's act of creation, principally looking to its union with the material. And when Wordsworth cannot realize the incarnation in himself or others, I think he rarely, if ever, brings it alive successfully in others. Peter Bell might be taken as a failed attempt. Then he resolves his difficulties by relying on the transcendental alone, sometimes asserting an orthodoxy. This is what he does for Margaret in The Excursion, which he didn't do in the original Ruined Cottage, where she did not live in the eye of nature, although nature was all around her. So she had no incarnational vision, the power of imagination not alive in her. Then what is originally meditation or imagination in the peddler becomes prayer in Margaret. And I quote, "Who in her worst distress had oft-times felt the unbounded might of prayer, and learned with soul fixed on the cross that consolation springs from sources deeper far than deepest vein to the meek sufferer." Wordsworth tries melding the two, meditation and prayer, by suggesting that the passing shows a being, including the deepest pain, could never maintain dominion o'er the enlightened spirit whose meditative sympathies repose upon the breast of faith. But it is not terribly convincing, has none of the passion and power of his earlier insights. It is also something to question whether suffering is relieved by the realization of paradise, whether Margaret could ever have got over the loss of her husband. Suffering is conventionally excluded from paradise. Adam and Eve had quite an easy time of it until the apple, and even then they enjoyed their senses in ways we might envy. Perhaps Wordsworth was thinking of Christ's word to his crucified fellows. "Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." I doubt that, though the presence of the cross might suggest that the meek sufferer is a figure incorporating both Margaret and Christ. Christ, who suffers the ultimate and horribly painful price or sacrifice, but believes he is on his way to paradise in the company of a couple of robbers. I think this distinction between the incarnational and transcendental matters when we come to the ode, because the one is realized in the other, particularly at the end of the poem, in a way predicated by the closing of the Ruined Cottage. So, to the ode. First, a few quick words about the title of the book, my book, that is. The poem has come in for much stick for being, in various degrees, unintelligible, a word first used by Francis Jeffrey on its publication in 1807. Wordsworth's friends and friendly reviewers didn't do much better. Southey, Hazlitt, Montgomery, and even Coleridge saw only bombast based on a semi-heretical idea. Coleridge, who surely should have been able to, never did provide a reading of it, only quotations. Possibly even Wordsworth was uncertain. It had no title, bar ode, and an enigmatic epigraph, let us sing of things a little greater. Henry Crabb Robinson persuaded him to provide a subtitle in 1814. That hardly helped. Where's the proclaimed immortality? What's the credibility of childhood recollections? Although the Victorians entitled it the Great Ode, and it shook Hopkins to the core, it left Ruskin, Bridges, Patmore, and Arnold cold. It continued to divide opinion into the 20th and 21st centuries. Even Eliot followed the herd and called it, in his backhand way, a fine piece of verbiage. Recent critical readings have come to no consensus. Is it a celebration or is it an elegy? Does it lament lost powers or recognize powers recovered? And whichever, or both, does its progress make any sense? Is it coherent? In a word, is it intelligible? Of course, I'm of the opinion that it largely is, and to that end, the intelligible ode is my tuppenny worth of exegesis. Earlier in the book, later here, I make a particular attempt to answer the immortality and recollection questions. What follows is mostly about the structure, the way in which the poem progresses, perhaps the first thing to understand about a poem in order to know whether it is intelligible or not. Like all good stories, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the end does what Coleridge thought all satisfactory stories and poems should do. It puts the snake's tail in its mouth, the beginning revisited and revised in the conclusion. I think the ode has 4 distinct phases, corresponding closely to Harold Bloom's idea, but working to a different end. A statement of loss, an analysis of loss, a recovery, and a resolution. The beginning consists of stanzas 1 to 4, divided into 2 parts, 2 stanzas each. The opening stanza, "There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth and every common sight to me did seem apparelled in celestial light," is a very general statement of loss, covering everything, followed by a more detailed description in the second, ending, "But yet I know where'er I go, there hath passed away a glory from the earth. Paradise is absent, mind and nature, feeling and seeing are not at one." These 2 stanzas are a simple assertion of loss. From loss, one naturally seeks recovery, and the next 2 verses, twice as long as the first 2, make that attempt. Here begin some of the key problems of the poem. It is springtime, and all creatures in the earth and sea are giving themselves up to jollity, to a celebration of the arrival of spring. As all this is going on, an isolating thought of grief beleaguers the poet, interrupting his desired participation in the merriment. One presumes, though it is far from certain, that the thought of grief is an oblique reference to the loss outlined in the first 2 verses. The gloomy Wordsworth is out of sync with the joys of spring. The reader hardly has time to digest this, and they are told in the very next 2 lines, "A timely utterance gave that thought relief, and I again am strong." That is a mighty quick turnaround, partially betrayed a line later when he says, "No more shall grief of mine the season wrong," as if he is still fighting that grief. The nature of that utterance has never been satisfactorily explained. In my view, it is a kind of subconscious glimpse of what he will fully unpack later in the poem. But here, the divisive grief and the consoling utterance have little substance. He wants to prove he is strong again. So we get those bombastic lines about trumpeting cataracts, mountain echoes, and winds from the fields of sleep, all strong images. I spent several pages in the book attempting to demonstrate that, in fact, they are fairly precise references to other poems and ideas, not bombast at all, but high-energy, well-focused metaphors which seek to express his recovery and then act as a prelude to the long list of the joys that come with spring. This celebration continues into and occupies almost all of the 4th verse, the poet asserting that "my heart is at your festival, at one with the spirit of spring." Many critics have found in these lines a forced jollity, slightly hysterical, and even if, knowing what is to come, that's a retrospective reading, I think it is how they are best read. And there are hints, even in the course of this celebration, that it all is not well. "O evil day, if I was sullen, while earth herself is adorning this sweet May morning." He is still resisting an unresolved grief. And the stanza closes with those magical lines beginning, "But there's a tree of many one," bringing us down to earth and back to the beginning of the poem, a mini snake and tail, all attempts at resolution failed, and which conclude, "Whither is fled the visionary gleam? Where is it now, the glory and the dream?" And so ends the beginning. But there has been an almost unnoticeable development. The section begins with a statement of loss. It ends with the question, where is that vision now? Where has it gone? The presumption is that it has gone somewhere, and so, if thoughtful, might be found. I have taken stanzas 5 to 8 as the middle of the poem, the analysis of loss, beginning, "Our earth is but asleep and a forgetting," ending, "Heavy as frost and deep almost as life." These verses, I think of as essentially answering the question, where has it gone? Wordsworth pondered the problem the 2 years between 1802 and 1804. And when it came to him, it came suddenly, what I called a eureka moment. I've got it. The glory we once knew we've lost by being born to this life. The first and last lines of this section, taken together, almost say it all. Life is lost in life. The soul begins to be smothered and frozen soon after birth by a life that is not life. But the problem is that this smothering life is our life, and so ensues a war between the two forms of life, in which the child is the hero because they can still remember the glory invested in the soul as it descended from heaven. They have the intuitive knowledge, power, and vision that the adult loses by living. But the child is also the villain of the piece, because they blindly adopt all the deadening customs of the adult, as if their whole vocation were endless imitation. And so the vision splendid fades into the light of common day, this common day, the antithesis of the simple produce of the common day. There is a constant emotional, almost paradoxical ambivalence running through these stanzas. The youth, travelling steadily away from the light of the east, whence his soul arose, towards the west, is nonetheless attended by the vision splendid. The earth is a good place, full of pleasures of her own, of no unworthy aim, nursing the child with something of a mother's mind. But her intention is to make the child forget the glories they have known, surely an unworthy aim. The long description of life in the nursery is delightful, and most parents would recognize it as substantially true. But stanza 8 turns on the child and asks, why with such earnest pains dost thou provoke the years to bring the inevitable yoke, thus blindly with thy blessedness at strife? Why are you a traitor to yourself? And again, paradoxically, demonstrating the division in him, Wordsworth blames the child for provoking what is anyhow inevitable. But these are all, in some sense, rhetorical questions, all accounts of what does happen and can't be undone. Wordsworth is now again in a different place. He understands the causes of his loss, and that the loss is in itself irrecoverable. As he says in stanza 10, the radiance which was once so bright is now forever taken from my sight. But what is not lost is the memory that it has been. And what that memory hints at is the linchpin of the recovery which is worked through in stanzas 9 and 10. The thought of our past years in need upbreed, perpetual benediction, a constant, continual blessing, resonant of the Puritan belief that a single experience of grace is sufficient for one's salvation. There are lots of difficulties in stanza 9, principally associated with the nature of these memories, because they are not so much memories as sensations or feelings, shadowy recollections. The imprecision for which these lines are sometimes criticized, their lack of distinct reference, a failure of articulation, a kind of woolly visionariness, slightly misses the point, because it is more important what these recollections are doing than what they are. Obstinate questionings of sense and outward things dismiss the impressions of vulgar sense. Blank misgivings of a creature moving about in worlds not realized make us conscious that such worlds exist behind the worlds of sense. There are things visible and invisible, or in Coleridge's words, there is another world that now is. High instincts are those before which our mortal nature trembles, with guilt in the ghostly presence of a much greater world. There is a hint here of what Hamlet said, horrified before the ghost of his father. We are fools of nature, our dispositions shaken with thoughts beyond the reaches of our souls, beyond what we can easily articulate. Wordsworth tries hard to rehearse the long list: shadowy recollections, obstinate questionings, blank misgivings, high instincts, fallings from us, vanishings, first affections. But in the end, he gives up with, which be they what they may, adding, and here, if anywhere, is the core of the poem, are yet the fountain light of all our day, are yet a master light of all our seeing. That seeing, apparelled in celestial light, innate in the child, lost to the adult, that seeing which is also feeling. These inexpressible powers derived from childhood experience are the sources of our perpetual benediction, the embers still glowing, which man or boy nor all that is at enmity with joy can utterly abolish or destroy. It is worth remembering that as a prelude to this list of benedictions, a song of thanks and praise, Wordsworth dismissed what is most worthy to be blessed, the simple creed of childhood, delight and liberty, all that goes on in the nursery, things that have a name, create a belief, a creed, for what in itself is good. He is rehearsing with the same emotional ambivalence the distinction he made in stanzas 7 and 8, the child at play as the victim of custom, and the child whose exterior semblance doth belie thy soul's immensity. This tentative reconnection with the visionary child enables at least a partial revival of visionary power in the adult. The adult, or their soul, and Wordsworth regularly distinguishes the two, comparable to his distinction between the two kinds of child, now has, however far away, however far inland, sight of that immortal sea which brought us hither, and can hear the mighty waters rolling evermore. He is tentatively reconnected to the sources of immortality. His grief resolved, he turns back to the day he has forgotten and invokes his initial and failed celebration. Then sing, ye birds, sing a joyous song, and the next 6 lines are a deliberate reprise of that initially unshareable joy. But then comes an echo of the doubt that separated him from the Maytime festival. Though nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass, of glory in the flower, we will grieve not, rather find strength in what remained behind. This is too close to a timely utterance gave that thought relief, and I again am strong, to be definitely convincing. And here the reader has to make a decision. Is this a recovery or not? What follows doesn't help much. We're to find our strength in the primal sympathy which, having been, must ever be. Another echo of the Puritan idea of grace, once blessed, always blessed. But that sympathy is of a very peculiar kind, for it permits, even requires, soothing thoughts to spring out of human suffering. One can hardly imagine anything less sympathetic. But it is here that we come back to Margaret. The sight of the speargrass, by mist and silent rain's silvered o'er, filled the pedlar's mind with so still an image of tranquillity that what we feel of sorrow and despair, all the grief the passing shows of being leave behind, appeared an idle dream that could not live where meditation was. Consequently, despite the relentless, unrelieved suffering of Margaret, a story told in great detail and with great sympathy, the pedlar then says, I turned away and walked along my road in happiness. Rightly or wrongly, I take those words as the gloss to soothing thoughts that spring out of human suffering. They are consistent with the 2 lines that follow, and are the last of this, the penultimate stanza. In the faith that looks through death, in years that bring the philosophic mind. Meditation, or the philosophic mind at work, enabled the pedlar to look through death. I will come back to the philosophic mind in some comments on recollections. These lines from the prelude summarize the key process of the ode. The soul, remembering how she felt, but what she felt, remembering not, retains an obscure sense of possible sublimity, to which with growing faculties she doth aspire. The aspiration to sublimity is a passing through nature, or passing through all nature to rest with God, a looking through the death to that which is life divine and true. And the growing faculties, I suggest, are the growth of reason, or the philosophic mind. Here it is, of course, a transcendent process, a leaving of this life behind, and not one of incarnation. But one can't have incarnation without transcendence. I think there are indications that incarnation is achieved in the final stanza, the division between seeing and feeling resolved. The first line, and oh, ye fountains, meadows, hills and groves, evokes the first line of the poem, though the time when meadow, grove, and stream, with the next two mark the difference. First, think not of the severing of our loves, celebrates their union, if fearing their division. And then, yet in my heart of hearts I feel your might. A reciprocal power has returned with a reciprocal feeling. Seeing and feeling are no longer separate. And in that union we might see a modest intimation with paradise regained. Indeed, his love of nature is stronger than it was in his youth. I love the brooks which down their channels fret, even more than when I tripped, as lightly as they. But as grief and fear of grief are counterpoints to the advent of joy, so here consciousness of our mortality, of Margaret and Michael's progress through life, may be the clouds that gather round the setting sun. In that sun setting, perhaps Wordsworth's consciousness of declining powers. But life is not just attending to the still sad music of humanity. Another race had been, and other palms are one. These are elusive lines. What race? What palms? I have no clear idea. But as the story of mortality precedes the story of the growth of a redeeming power in the ruined cottage, perhaps something akin to the peddler's race and his palms. If we take human as the distinctly human, then the joys and fears here may be the joys and fears that constituted the growth of the peddler's mind and soul, in which case the speargrass epitomizes the meanest flower that blows, producing thoughts that are more profound than and supersede any tears shed for our mortality, that idle dream. Thus says Wordsworth at the end of the ode, we can turn away and walk along our road in happiness. Now a few words about immortality and then about recollection. For Wordsworth, immortality is not a state to be arrived at, an endless existence in time, finding a path to the pearly gates through virtue and belief, where we can meet in that sad old phrase, those gone before us. It begins with his recognition that death is death, and nothing of our human nature survives death. What he said of John and Matthew, summed up by the peddler, we die, my friend, and very soon, even of the good is no memorial left. He says repeatedly in other poems, notably in his reflections on the death of his daughter Catherine. And each time he comes to the conclusion he would rather not, that after death, nothing recognizably human remains. There is no resurrection of the body, nothing of what Orthodox Christian belief peculiarly and defiantly continues to assert. The former Bishop of Durham, David Jenkins, mocked such teaching when he described it as a conjuring trick, Burns. That conventional Christian doctrine was tacitly rejected as long ago as the 17th century, which produced many essays asserting the immortality and immateriality of the soul, essentially Wordsworth's position. In the ode, he writes of the soul that rises with us, our life star, hath had elsewhere its setting and cometh from afar. We and our soul do not come from the same place. Our body is ours, but what we call our soul is given to us, but a gift never fully ours. In lines written in early spring, he speaks of the human soul that through me ran. This distinction is implicit when he addresses the child as thou, over whom thy immortality broods like the day, a master or a slave, a presence which is not to be put by. The distinction and the relationship is powerfully, if for some unfortunately, expressed. He also wrote, the soul may be re-given when it had been taken away. Immortality is a quality of the soul, and our immortality, a relationship with that power not ours, nonetheless a birthright, but which we lose as material life closes in. In addressing the child, it seems that the mastering presence of immortality is integral to thy soul's immensity. Crush the soul with earthly freight, and out goes the individual sense of immortality. Or to continue the metaphor, the master no longer has a slave, no one to do his bidding, and the slave is free but powerless. It is the relationship between the two that enables the child to be, thou best philosopher, mighty prophet, seer blessed. and to pound gently on the word seer. Only someone in whom that relationship exists can see the world apparelled in celestial light, a paradise which for Wordsworth was near synonymous with immortality. Most often the freed slave takes on a new master, the senses, and forgets the glories he has known. Wordsworth consistently rejects the senses as a source of life. Habit enslaves the mind, oppresses it by the laws of vulgar sense. Whose mind is but the mind of his own eyes, he is a slave, the meanest we can meet. And of himself he says that mastering his heart, the most despotic of our senses, the eye, gained such strength in me as often held my mind in absolute dominion. In a word, he became enslaved to sense, exiled from paradise. And now, recollections. Wordsworth tells us, both in the Fenwick note and, of course, in the subtitle of the poem, that it all hangs on childhood recollections. Have no experience of those, doubt their credibility, and the poem isn't really intelligible. Many readers, Coleridge included, have had such doubts. Perhaps they are simply an idiosyncratic psychological curiosity, more or less unique. Or we should read them as Freud did, the child's oceanic feeling, experienced prior to realizing the distinction of the ego and the world. It isn't difficult to imagine such a feeling described as paradise, particularly in the world which Wordsworth was heir to. And that would certainly explain why such recollections are shadowy. They come from a time when memory barely exists. I haven't traced it out, but I think Wordsworth's awareness of the glories of childhood grew in him as he grew up, and that there's not much of this consciousness prior to Tintern Abbey. But the glories were slowly recovered only for him to realize they were no more. The memory existed, but not the experience. Such doubts cannot be lightly dismissed. Here is one of English literature's greatest poems, apparently founded on a peculiar form of consciousness which few share. So we get back to the magnificence of the music and the dearth of meaning. But a new poet can change the history of poetry, said Eliot. In the 1920s, Traherne was a new poet. In my view, his thought and poetry substantiates Wordsworth's vision to a truly remarkable extent, and could revise the critical history of this poem. Traherne sets out the experience of a childhood paradise, the causes of its loss, and the method of recovery, with a confidence and clarity Wordsworth might have envied when taking the same path much more tentatively. Those of you who have seen the flyer for this talk will have seen my summary of this parallel progress in 3 extracts from Traherne's work. Here are the first 2, first describing the vision. How like an angel came I down, how bright are all things here. When first among his works I did appear, oh, how their glory did me crown. The world resembled his eternity, in which my soul did walk, and everything that I did see did with me talk. And then the loss. The first light which shined in me in my infancy was totally eclipsed. If you ask me how it was eclipsed, truly by the customs and manners of men, which like contrary winds blew it out. It is not our parents' loins, so much as our parents' lives, that enthralls and blinds us. But the recovery is more of a problem, which I believe happens in the final stanza 11. This is what Traherne says. I knew by intuition those things which since my apostasy I collected again by the highest reason. After the apostasy, although intuition is a power lost, the vision can be renewed by the use of highest reason. The highest reason? Remember, Traherne was an Oxford-educated Cambridge Platonist. This is not rationality, though it is not irrational. It is that reason which Coleridge capitalized to distinguish it from the understanding, called Descartes' reason. It is a spiritual power which finds itself not only in the mind, but in the material world. This, I suggest, is why Wordsworth calls the child our best philosopher. The child knows what adult philosophers struggle to know. And although it is easily dismissed as too light a reference to take seriously, I think he is referring to the growth of this form of reason when writing of the years that bring the philosophic mind, the growth of faculties to which the soul doth aspire. Traherne believes that the power of reason even enriches the childhood vision. I remember the time when the dust of the streets was pleasing as gold to my infant eyes, and now they are more precious to the eye of reason. Perhaps this is echoed in a couple of the closing lines of the ode I have already quoted. I love the brooks which down their channels fret, even more than when I tripped lightly as they. Lines that come after the years that bring the philosophic mind. To make one final connection between Traherne and Wordsworth and Coleridge, Traherne's highest reason might be reason in her most exalted mood, Wordsworth's definition of the imagination. That imagination which Coleridge wanted to unite with reason in the last chapter of the Biographia. Perhaps the reason of the Cambridge Platonists has become the imagination of the Romantics. That's it. Many thanks. I'm done.
Thank you. Many thanks, Graham. Thanks for that fantastic talk. I think all of us will appreciate that compelling weaving together that you did there of the ode with the prospectus to the recluse and the ruined cottage. And I noted down a key moment, I think, when about halfway through your talk, you noted that contradictory struggle that's animating the poet, in which the child is both the hero, you said, and the villain of the piece, rushing to fade into the light of common day. And you pointed out there that this common is the antithesis of the prospectus's simple produce of the common day. So you're kind of helping us to put those poems together, but also to see how Wordsworth is rewriting or rethinking things from his other poetry in the ode. I'm sure there'll be many questions, but if I can claim chair's privilege, can I ask a first one? And given that we're with the Friends of Coleridge, can I ask you about Coleridge? Coleridge's criticism of the ode had to do with bombast, as you said. That's the word he keeps on sort of harping on. Or mental bombast is it that he says. Can I just ask you to speak a bit more about that, Graham? So he seemed to keep on coming back to it. What was he really getting at? Or if I can put it another way, picking up your opening line about Collingwood and the artist kind of trying to solve a problem. What problem do you think Coleridge thought the ode was answering, or what problem was it failing to answer in his view?
I always take Coleridge's response, of course, to be the verse letter. And the verse letter was written, of course, after Coleridge had heard only the first 4 verses. So he was in a sense saying, well, Wordsworth was asking, where has the vision gone? Coleridge was saying, you can rediscover it through love. It was, it was essentially, the Dejection Ode was essentially a marriage poem. It was love and holy passion, and this is what will recover your vision. That was his idea. But for me, it clearly wasn't Wordsworth's idea. It wasn't, if you like, it wasn't anything going to be solved by something which Coleridge seriously wanted, which marriage, which he thought would bring back harmony to his life. It was a completely different concept. And I think I say in the book, I think he never got hold of what Wordsworth was really trying to do. It seems very odd, but he doesn't ever respond to the ode in a way which seems actually at all intelligent, really, to be honest. He quotes the ode a lot, but he never says this is what it's about. And he actually says, well, this is for, what's it exactly? Basically says, this is for very recherché poems for very recherché minds. At some stage, exact phrasing I've forgotten. But and he also says it's for people who are willing to follow the flux of their own minds. So he's making two contradictory statements. Oh yes, he compares it to the high argument of Dante, doesn't he, at some stage? For very, for minds really at the top end of there. So he doesn't think it for ordinary people. So I think I have to come back to the point. I don't think Coleridge actually got it, although he quoted it, didn't he, in 1806 when he was in Rome to a German count, I think it was. I don't think he. I really haven't got an adequate answer for you, Tom, I'm
afraid. That's great. Well, I don't. I remember Richard Gravel had a line about it. His criticisms being, I think he said they're worthy of Geoffrey. The criticisms in the Biographia, where he says things like the stuff about the child being the best philosopher.
Yeah,
he says something in the Biographia about this could be equally said of a bee or a field or something.
I think he took real exception as being a professional, semi-professional philosopher to think that an uneducated, child who can hardly speak was in a better state of mind than he was. I mean, he didn't get it. He just didn't get it. But I always think in a situation like this, other people ought to answer the questions that are raised rather than me.